The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace as James Morrison adjusted his red uniform one last time. After 23 years of faithful service as a royal guard, he had never imagined he would find himself at the center of such a scandal. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he straightened his black bearskin hat, knowing that today would change everything. The events that led to this moment began 3 weeks earlier, during what should have been a routine morning shift. James had been stationed outside the Queen's private study when he witnessed something that would haunt him for days. Queen Camilla had been in an intense conversation with her personal secretary, Victoria Pemberton, about a missing antique brooch worth over £2 million. The Cartier diamond brooch, a wedding gift from King Charles, had mysteriously disappeared from the Queen's jewelry collection. Palace officials were in chaos, conducting discreet investigations while trying to keep the matter from reaching the press. The insurance company was asking difficult questions, and the royal family's reputation hung in the balance. James remembered the exact moment when everything changed. He had been standing perfectly still as trained when Queen Camilla's voice rose in frustration. Through the slightly open door, he heard her say something that made his blood run cold. She was discussing how to handle the situation, and his name came up in a way that suggested he might be blamed for the theft. The conversation revealed that security footage from the corridor where James was stationed had gone missing for that particular day. Without the footage, there was no way to prove what had really happened in the Queen's chambers. Someone had deliberately erased the evidence, and now fingers were pointing in his direction. James had served the royal family with honor and dignity his entire adult life. He had missed his own daughter's wedding to work a state dinner. He had stood guard during countless ceremonies, never once faltering in his duties. The thought of being falsely accused of theft was devastating to a man who had built his entire identity around loyalty and service. That evening, James went home to his small flat in London, his mind racing with worry. His wife, Margaret, noticed his distress immediately. They had been married for 30 years, and she could read his emotions like an open book. When he finally told her what he had overheard, she was furious. Margaret had always been protective of her husband, and the idea that he could be used as a scapegoat was unacceptable to her. The next few days were torture for James. He continued his duties as normal, but he could feel the suspicious glances from other staff members. Whispers followed him through the corridors, and he noticed that some of his colleagues were avoiding him. The palace was a small community, and news traveled fast even when it was supposed to be confidential. James began to pay closer attention to everything happening around him. He started keeping detailed notes of his observations, times, and conversations. If he was going to be accused of something he didn't do, he wanted to be prepared. His military training had taught him to be observant, and now he was using those skills to protect himself. During his research, James discovered something interesting. The day the brooch went missing, there had been several visitors to the palace, including some members of the Queen's extended family and their guests. The security protocols for family visits were less strict than for official state functions, which meant there were more opportunities for someone to access restricted areas. One particular detail caught his attention. Lady Patricia Thornberry, a distant cousin of Queen Camilla, had been visiting that day with her daughter and son-in-law. James remembered seeing them because the daughter had been wearing an unusually expensive-looking necklace that seemed out of place for someone of her supposed social standing. At the time, he had dismissed it as none of his business, but now he wondered if there might be more to the story. James also recalled that Victoria Pemberton, the Queen's secretary, had seemed unusually nervous that day. She had been making frequent trips to the Queen's study and had looked startled when she noticed James observing her movements. Victoria had been with the royal household for only 8 months, having been hired to replace the previous secretary who had retired after 40 years of service. The more James thought about the situation, the more convinced he became that he was being set up to take the fall for someone else's crime. The missing security footage was too convenient, and the timing of the accusations against him was suspicious. Someone with access to the security system had deliberately erased the evidence, and that someone had to be working from inside the palace. As James prepared for what he suspected would be his final day of service, he made a decision that would change everything. He would not go quietly into the night, accepting blame for something he didn't do. Instead, he would use his knowledge of palace operations and his keen, observational skills to uncover the truth. The loyalty that had defined his career would now drive him to protect not only his own reputation but also the integrity of the institution he had served so faithfully. James Morrison was about to become an unlikely detective, and his investigation would reveal secrets that would shock everyone involved. Little did he know that his quest for justice would expose a web of deception that reached much higher than a simple theft. The truth about the missing brooch would ultimately save his career and restore his honor. But the journey to get there would test everything he believed about loyalty, justice, and the people he had sworn to serve. James Morrison knew he had to act fast. If Queen Camilla was planning to blame him for the missing brooch, he needed evidence to prove his innocence. The problem was that as a palace guard, he had limited access to the areas where the real investigation was taking place. However, his years of service had taught him the rhythms of palace life, and he knew exactly when and where to look for information. The next morning, James arrived at work earlier than usual. He had formulated a plan during his sleepless night, and now it was time to put it into action. His first stop was the security office, where his friend David Chen worked as a technical supervisor. David had been responsible for maintaining the palace's surveillance system for over 15 years, and if anyone could explain the missing footage, it would be him. David looked uncomfortable when James approached him about the erased recording. After some gentle persuasion and reminders of their long friendship, David revealed something shocking. The security footage hadn't been accidentally deleted or lost due to technical problems. Someone with administrative access had deliberately removed it from the system, and they had done so within hours of the brooch being reported missing. The revelation hit James like a punch to the stomach. Not only was he being framed, but someone with significant authority within the palace was actively covering their tracks. David explained that only 5 people had the administrative access needed to delete security footage: the head of security, the palace manager, and 3 senior staff members, including Victoria Pemberton. Armed with this information, James began to focus his attention on Victoria. As Queen Camilla's personal secretary, she had access to the Queen's private chambers and would know the exact location of the jewelry collection. She also had the administrative privileges needed to tamper with the security system. Most importantly, she was relatively new to the position, which meant she might not have the same loyalty to the institution that longer-serving staff members possessed. James started observing Victoria's behavior more carefully. During his shifts outside the Queen's study, he noticed that she often seemed anxious and distracted. She frequently checked her phone, which was unusual for someone in such a prestigious position where personal devices were typically kept to a minimum during working hours. Victoria also had a habit of staying late after the Queen had finished her daily appointments, claiming she needed extra time to organize files and correspondence. One evening, James decided to take a risk. Using his knowledge of the palace's layout and security rotations, he positioned himself where he could observe Victoria's late-night activities without being detected. What he saw confirmed his suspicions and provided him with the first real clue about what had happened to the missing brooch. Victoria was not working on correspondence as she claimed. Instead, she was making phone calls from the Queen's study, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. James couldn't hear the entire conversation, but he caught enough fragments to understand that Victoria was discussing money and expressing concern about deadlines and payments. The conversation lasted nearly 30 minutes, and Victoria seemed increasingly agitated as it progressed. After the call ended, James watched as Victoria opened one of the Queen's desk drawers and removed what appeared to be a small wrapped package. She handled it carefully as if it contained something valuable and fragile. Victoria then placed the package in her personal handbag before gathering her things to leave for the evening. James knew he was onto something significant, but he also realized he needed more evidence before he could make any accusations. Victoria Pemberton was in a position of trust, and her word would carry much more weight than his if it came down to a confrontation. He needed to find proof that would be undeniable. The next day, James used his break time to do some research on Victoria's background. He accessed the employee database through a computer terminal in the staff break room, using credentials that his friend David had provided. What he discovered was troubling and provided a possible motive for the theft. Victoria had significant financial problems that she had not disclosed during her employment screening. She had accumulated substantial debt from gambling, including unpaid loans from several questionable sources. Her previous employment had ended abruptly under circumstances that were not clearly explained in her file, and there were gaps in her work history that raised additional questions. More importantly, James discovered that Victoria's salary as the Queen's secretary, while respectable, was nowhere near enough to cover her financial obligations. The mathematics were simple. She needed money desperately, and she had access to extremely valuable items that could be easily converted to cash. The missing brooch, worth over £2 million, would solve all of her financial problems. James also found evidence that Victoria had been researching the value of various items in the Queen's collection. Her computer search history, which was automatically logged by the palace's IT security system, showed multiple queries about antique jewelry appraisals and auction houses that specialized in high-end estate pieces. She had even visited websites that provided information about how to sell valuable items discreetly, without attracting attention. The pattern was clear. Victoria had identified the brooch as a target, planned the theft carefully, and then used her administrative access to delete the security footage that would have shown her removing the item from the Queen's chambers. She had then attempted to shift suspicion onto James, knowing that his position as a guard would make him an easy scapegoat. However, James still needed to figure out where Victoria had hidden the brooch and how she planned to convert it to cash. The item was too recognizable to sell through conventional channels, and any reputable auction house would require provenance documentation that Victoria couldn't provide. There had to be another part to her plan. James decided to expand his surveillance of Victoria's activities. He began documenting her movements, phone calls, and interactions with other people. He also started paying attention to any visitors she might have during her off-duty hours. If Victoria was planning to sell the brooch, she would need to make contact with someone who could handle such a transaction. His patience was rewarded 3 days later when he observed Victoria meeting with a man in an expensive suit outside the palace grounds during her lunch break. The meeting was brief but appeared to be significant, as both parties seemed nervous and kept looking around to ensure they weren't being observed. James was too far away to hear their conversation, but he was able to take several photographs with his phone. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. But James knew that his investigation was about to enter a dangerous phase. Victoria was clearly involved in something more complex than a simple theft, and the man she had met suggested that there were other people involved in the scheme. James realized that exposing the truth might put him in personal danger, but he was determined to clear his name and bring the real criminals to justice. As he prepared for the next phase of his investigation, James felt a mixture of excitement and fear. He was closer to proving his innocence than ever before, but he also knew that Victoria and her accomplices would not give up without a fight. The revelation he was about to uncover would change everything, not just for him, but for everyone involved in the conspiracy. James Morrison spent the weekend analyzing everything he had discovered about Victoria Pemberton and her mysterious meeting with the well-dressed stranger. Using his daughter's computer skills, he had managed to enhance the photographs he had taken, and what he saw made his investigation take an unexpected turn. The man Victoria had met was wearing an expensive watch and cufflinks that suggested he moved in wealthy circles, but there was something familiar about his appearance that James couldn't quite place. On Monday morning, James decided to take a different approach to his investigation. Instead of focusing solely on Victoria, he began to pay closer attention to the other people who had been in the palace on the day the brooch disappeared. His military training had taught him that the most effective way to solve a complex problem was to examine all the variables, not just the obvious ones. James retrieved the visitor log for that day and began studying the names and purposes of each visit. Most were routine appointments or official meetings, but the entry for Lady Patricia Thornberry and her family stood out. The visit had been arranged at short notice, and the stated purpose was simply listed as family consultation. This vague description was unusual for palace records, which typically provided detailed information about the nature of each visit. Intrigued by this discovery, James decided to learn more about Lady Patricia and her family. Using the palace's reference library during his break time, he researched the Thornberry family history and their connection to Queen Camilla. What he found was both illuminating and concerning. Lady Patricia Thornberry was indeed a distant cousin of Queen Camilla, but their relationship had been strained for several years due to financial disagreements. Patricia's late husband had made some poor investment decisions that had significantly reduced the family's wealth, leaving them struggling to maintain their aristocratic lifestyle. The family had been forced to sell several valuable properties and had been quietly asking relatives for financial assistance. More interesting was the information James found about Patricia's son-in-law, Alexander Whitmore. Alexander worked as an art and jewelry appraiser for several high-end auction houses in London. His expertise in evaluating and authenticating valuable antiques made him exactly the kind of person someone would need if they wanted to sell a stolen piece of jewelry without attracting attention. James felt his pulse quicken as he realized he might have stumbled onto something much bigger than a simple theft by a desperate secretary. If Lady Patricia's family was involved, it would explain how the theft had been planned so carefully and why Victoria had seemed so confident about her ability to dispose of the brooch without being caught. The guard decided to dig deeper into Alexander Whitmore's background. Using the internet access in the staff computer room, James researched Alexander's professional history and discovered some troubling information. Several years earlier, Alexander had been quietly dismissed from a prestigious auction house following questions about the authenticity of some pieces he had evaluated. While no formal charges had been filed, the incident had damaged his reputation in the industry. James also found evidence that Alexander had been struggling financially despite his professional credentials. His company, Whitmore Appraisals, had been losing clients steadily, and there were several outstanding legal judgments against him for unpaid debts. Like Victoria, Alexander appeared to be a person who needed money desperately and had the skills necessary to convert stolen goods into cash. The connection between Victoria and the Thornberry family was becoming clearer, but James still needed to understand how they had orchestrated the theft and what role Queen Camilla's accusation against him played in their plan. He suspected that Victoria had been recruited by Lady Patricia's family to steal the brooch, with the understanding that Alexander would handle its sale through his connections in the art world. James decided to take a significant risk by attempting to observe Victoria's activities outside the palace. Using his knowledge of her schedule and habits, he followed her after work one evening. Victoria took a circuitous route through London, frequently checking to see if she was being followed, before finally arriving at an upscale restaurant in Mayfair. Inside the restaurant, Victoria met with Lady Patricia Thornberry and Alexander Whitmore. James positioned himself at the bar where he could observe their table without being detected. The three of them engaged in what appeared to be an intense discussion, with Patricia doing most of the talking while Victoria and Alexander listened intently. James couldn't hear their conversation over the ambient noise of the restaurant, but their body language suggested they were discussing something urgent and problematic. Victoria appeared nervous and kept glancing around the room, while Alexander seemed agitated and frequently checked his watch. Lady Patricia, despite her aristocratic composure, looked stressed and occasionally raised her voice before quickly lowering it again. The meeting lasted approximately 1 hour, after which the three participants left separately. James decided to follow Alexander, hoping to gain additional insight into the group's plans. Alexander drove to a storage facility in an industrial area of London, where he accessed a unit and removed a small package similar to the one James had seen Victoria handling in the Queen's study. From his concealed position, James watched as Alexander carefully examined the contents of the package under a bright light. Even from a distance, the guard could see the distinctive sparkle of diamonds and precious metals. Alexander was clearly evaluating the stolen brooch, presumably to determine its value and the best method for converting it to cash. James realized that he was witnessing the final stages of a carefully planned conspiracy. Victoria had stolen the brooch using her access to the Queen's chambers. Lady Patricia had provided the connections and expertise needed to sell it, and Alexander was handling the actual appraisal and disposal of the stolen goods. The plan was sophisticated and would have been nearly impossible to detect if James hadn't been in the right place at the right time to overhear Queen Camilla's conversation about blaming him for the theft. The guard also understood why the conspirators had been so confident about framing him for the crime. As a palace employee with access to the Queen's chambers, James would have been a logical suspect. More importantly, His position as a working-class guard would make his word less credible than that of Lady Patricia, a member of the nobility, or Victoria, who held a position of trust within the royal household. James photographed Alexander examining the brooch and documented the location of the storage facility. He now had evidence that directly connected all three conspirators to the stolen jewelry, but he also realized that his investigation had reached a critical point. If he was going to expose the conspiracy, he needed to act quickly before the brooch was sold and the evidence disappeared forever. However, James also understood that confronting the conspirators directly would be dangerous. They had already shown they were willing to frame an innocent person to protect themselves, and they might be capable of more serious crimes if they felt cornered. He needed to find a way to expose them while protecting himself and ensuring that justice was served. As James drove home that evening, he knew that the next few days would determine not only his own future, but also whether the real criminals would be brought to justice. The evidence he had gathered was compelling, but presenting it to the authorities would require careful planning and perfect timing. One mistake could result in the conspirators escaping justice and James being blamed for a crime he didn't commit. James Morrison knew that time was running out. His investigation had revealed a conspiracy involving Victoria Pemberton, Lady Patricia Thornberry, and Alexander Whitmore, but he still needed to gather enough concrete evidence to prove their guilt beyond any doubt. More importantly, he had to find a way to present this evidence without putting himself in danger or giving the conspirators a chance to destroy the proof of their crimes. The guard spent Tuesday evening developing a plan that would expose the conspiracy while protecting his own interests. He realized that the key to success would be timing and documentation. If he could catch the conspirators in the act of selling the brooch or transferring it to a buyer, he would have irrefutable evidence of their guilt. James decided to contact his old friend Inspector Robert Hayes from the Metropolitan Police. Robert and James had served together in the military before taking different career paths, and James trusted him to handle the situation professionally and discreetly. However, James knew that he needed to present Robert with more than just suspicions and theories. Police officers required solid evidence before they could take action, especially when the case involved members of the royal household and nobility. On Wednesday morning, James made a decision that would change everything. Instead of waiting for the conspirators to make their next move, he would force them to act by creating a situation that required immediate action. His plan was risky, but it offered the best chance of gathering the evidence needed to prove his innocence and expose the real criminals. James began by spreading carefully crafted information through the palace's informal communication network. He let it be known, through casual conversations with other staff members, that the investigation into the missing brooch was intensifying and that authorities were planning to conduct detailed interviews with everyone who had access to the Queen's chambers on the day of the theft. The guard also made sure that Victoria overheard a conversation in which he mentioned that new security footage had been discovered from a backup system that might have captured activity in the Queen's private areas. This information was completely false, but James hoped it would panic Victoria and force her to contact her accomplices to accelerate their timeline for selling the brooch. James's strategy worked better than he had hoped. Within hours of spreading the false information, Victoria's behavior became noticeably more agitated. She made several urgent phone calls during her breaks and left work early, claiming she felt unwell. James followed her discreetly and observed her meeting with Lady Patricia and Alexander at a coffee shop near Victoria Station. The meeting was brief, but clearly urgent. All three participants appeared stressed, and their conversation was animated despite their obvious attempts to remain inconspicuous. After the meeting ended, Alexander immediately drove to the storage facility where he had examined the brooch, while Victoria and Lady Patricia went their separate ways. James positioned himself near the storage facility and waited. His patience was rewarded when Alexander emerged 30 minutes later carrying a small briefcase. Instead of returning home, Alexander drove to an address in Notting Hill that James had never seen before. The guard followed at a safe distance and observed Alexander entering an expensive-looking townhouse. Through careful observation, James learned that the townhouse belonged to Marcus Rothschild, a private art dealer who was known for handling transactions that required discretion. Rothschild specialized in helping wealthy clients buy and sell valuable items without the publicity that typically accompanied auction house sales. His client list included several celebrities and business leaders who preferred to keep their art transactions private. James realized that this was the final link in the conspiracy chain. Alexander had arranged for Rothschild to purchase the stolen brooch, probably at a fraction of its true value, but still enough to solve the financial problems of all the conspirators. The transaction was scheduled to take place soon, which explained the urgency of their recent meeting. The guard knew that he had to act quickly. Once the brooch was sold to Rothschild and the money was distributed among the conspirators, it would be much more difficult to prove the connection between the theft and the guilty parties. James called Inspector Hayes and explained the situation, providing detailed information about his investigation and the evidence he had gathered. Inspector Hayes was initially skeptical about James's claims, particularly the allegations involving Lady Patricia Thornberry. However, the photographs and documentation that James had collected were compelling, and Hayes agreed to investigate further. The inspector explained that they would need to catch the conspirators in the act of transferring the stolen goods or the money from their sale. Working together, James and Inspector Hayes developed a plan to monitor the suspected transaction between Alexander and Marcus Rothschild. Hayes arranged for undercover officers to observe the townhouse, while James continued his surveillance of Victoria and Lady Patricia. If the conspirators attempted to complete the sale of the brooch, the police would have the evidence needed to make arrests. On Thursday evening, James observed increased activity around all the key participants. Victoria left the palace earlier than usual and drove to Lady Patricia's residence in Chelsea. Alexander arrived at the same location 30 minutes later, carrying the same briefcase James had seen at the storage facility. The three conspirators spent 2 hours in Lady Patricia's house before emerging together and driving to Marcus Rothschild's townhouse in Notting Hill. James immediately contacted Inspector Hayes, who confirmed that undercover officers were in position around Rothschild's property. The trap was set, and if the conspirators proceeded with the sale of the stolen brooch, they would be caught red-handed with evidence that would be impossible to deny or explain away. However, James also realized that the next few hours would be the most dangerous part of his entire investigation. If something went wrong with the police operation, or if the conspirators realized they were being watched, they might attempt to destroy the evidence and intensify their efforts to frame James for the theft. The guard had committed himself to a course of action that could either vindicate him completely or result in his being charged with a crime he didn't commit. As James waited in his car near Rothschild's townhouse, he reflected on the events that had led to this moment. 3 weeks earlier, he had been a loyal palace guard with an unblemished record of service. Now he was an amateur detective whose investigation had uncovered a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of British society. The outcome of the next few hours would determine not only his own future but also whether justice would be served for all the people involved in this elaborate crime. The lights were on in Rothschild's townhouse, and James could see silhouettes moving behind the expensive curtains. Inside, the final act of the conspiracy was being played out, with the stolen brooch about to change hands for the last time. James checked his phone to ensure he had a clear signal to contact Inspector Hayes if necessary, then settled in to wait for the conclusion of the most important night of his life. The evening air was crisp as James Morrison sat in his car across from Marcus Rothschild's townhouse, watching the shadows move behind the illuminated windows. His phone buzzed quietly, indicating a text message from Inspector Hayes confirming that undercover officers were positioned at strategic locations around the property. Everything was in place for what James hoped would be the final act of his investigation. At exactly 9:30, James observed Alexander Whitmore approaching the front door of the townhouse, carrying the familiar briefcase that contained the stolen brooch. Alexander appeared nervous, frequently looking over his shoulder and checking his watch. Lady Patricia Thornberry and Victoria Pemberton remained in a car parked nearby, presumably waiting to see the outcome of the transaction before making their own moves. James watched as Alexander was admitted into the house by Marcus Rothschild himself. Through the large front windows, he could see the two men moving into what appeared to be a well-appointed study or office. The guard knew that the critical moment was approaching, and he prepared to document whatever happened. Next, Inspector Hayes had equipped James with a small recording device and instructed him to try to capture any conversations that might provide additional evidence of the conspiracy. James activated the device and moved closer to the townhouse, using his military training to approach the building without being detected by the occupants or attracting attention from neighbors. From a position near the study window, James could hear fragments of the conversation between Alexander and Rothschild. The art dealer was examining the brooch with a jeweler's loupe, while Alexander provided information about its provenance and history. Rothschild seemed impressed by the piece but was clearly suspicious about how Alexander had acquired such a valuable item. The negotiation between the two men was tense and careful. Rothschild was offering significantly less money than the brooch was worth, explaining that the lack of proper documentation and the need for discretion reduced its market value substantially. Alexander appeared frustrated by the low offer but was clearly under pressure to complete the transaction quickly. James recorded as much of the conversation as possible while photographing the exchange through the window. The evidence he was gathering would be crucial for proving that Alexander was knowingly selling stolen property, and that Rothschild was acting as a fence for the criminal conspiracy. However, the situation took an unexpected turn when Rothschild suddenly stopped examining the brooch and looked directly toward the window where James was positioned. The art dealer had noticed the flash from James's camera and realized that someone was observing the transaction. Rothschild immediately moved away from the window and began speaking urgently to Alexander. James knew that he had been discovered and that the situation was about to become dangerous. He quickly moved away from the window and prepared to contact Inspector Hayes to initiate the arrest operation. However, before he could make the call, Alexander burst out of the townhouse and began running toward the car where Lady Patricia and Victoria were waiting. The escape attempt triggered the police operation that Inspector Hayes had carefully planned. Undercover officers emerged from their concealed positions and moved to intercept all three conspirators. Alexander was caught before he could reach the car, while Victoria and Lady Patricia were detained as they attempted to drive away from the scene. James watched from a safe distance as the arrests took place. Inspector Hayes approached him and confirmed that all three suspects were in custody and that the stolen brooch had been recovered from Alexander's briefcase. The evidence that James had gathered, combined with the police observation of the attempted sale, provided overwhelming proof of the conspiracy to steal and sell the Queen's jewelry. Marcus Rothschild was also detained for questioning about his role in the attempted purchase of stolen goods. While he claimed that he had been unaware of the brooch's criminal origins, the recording that James had made of their conversation suggested otherwise. Rothschild's willingness to purchase such a valuable item without proper documentation indicated that he was experienced in handling questionable transactions. The most dramatic moment came when Inspector Hayes informed James that Victoria Pemberton had immediately confessed to her role in the theft once she realized that the police had overwhelming evidence against her. Victoria revealed that she had been approached by Lady Patricia several months earlier with a proposal to steal valuable items from the Queen's collection in exchange for enough money to solve her gambling debts. Victoria's confession provided details about how the conspiracy had been planned and executed. Lady Patricia had used her relationship with Queen Camilla to gain information about the palace's security procedures and the location of the most valuable items in the royal collection. Alexander had provided expertise about which pieces would be easiest to sell and had arranged for Marcus Rothschild to act as a buyer for the stolen goods. The plan to frame James Morrison for the theft had been Victoria's suggestion. She had used her administrative access to delete the security footage and had encouraged Queen Camilla to focus suspicion on the palace guards, rather than looking for other explanations for the missing brooch. Victoria had believed that James's working-class background would make him an easy target for accusations, and that no one would seriously investigate his claims of innocence. However, Victoria had not anticipated James's determination to clear his name or his skill at conducting his own investigation. The guard's military training and his intimate knowledge of palace operations had enabled him to uncover evidence that even professional investigators might have missed. His willingness to take personal risks to gather proof had been the key factor in exposing the conspiracy. Inspector Hayes explained to James that his evidence would be crucial for prosecuting all the participants in the conspiracy. The photographs, recordings, and documentation that James had collected provided a clear timeline of the crime and established the guilt of everyone involved. Without James's investigation, the conspirators might have succeeded in selling the brooch and escaping justice, while an innocent man was blamed for their crime. As the police vehicles departed with the suspects, James felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The investigation that had consumed his life for the past 3 weeks was finally over, and his innocence had been proven beyond any doubt. However, he also knew that the aftermath of the case would bring its own challenges, and that his life at the palace would never be quite the same. The revelation that Queen Camilla had been willing to blame him for the theft without conducting a thorough investigation was particularly painful for James. After 23 years of loyal service, he had expected more trust and support from the royal family he had devoted his life to protecting. The experience had taught him valuable lessons about loyalty, justice, and the importance of standing up for himself when others were willing to sacrifice him for their own convenience. James drove home that night knowing that he had not only cleared his name but had also prevented a serious injustice from occurring. His investigation had exposed criminals who had betrayed the trust placed in them and had saved the reputation of the royal family from a scandal that could have had lasting consequences. The morning after the arrests brought an unusual quiet to Buckingham Palace. News of the conspiracy had not yet reached the public, but within the palace walls, staff members whispered about the dramatic events that had unfolded the previous evening. James Morrison arrived for his shift, knowing that everything had changed, but uncertain about how the royal family would respond to the revelation that they had almost blamed an innocent man for a crime committed by people they trusted. Inspector Hayes had briefed palace security about the arrests and the recovery of the stolen brooch during an early morning meeting. The inspector had praised James's investigative work and made it clear that without the guards' determination and skill, the real criminals might never have been caught. However, James knew that the royal family's reaction to these events would determine his future at the palace. James had barely begun his morning duties when he received an unexpected summons to report to the Queen's private study immediately. The same room where he had first overheard the conversation that started his investigation was now the place where he would learn whether his 23 years of service would be recognized or whether he would face consequences for his unauthorized investigation. As James approached the study, he felt the same mixture of nervousness and determination that had sustained him throughout his investigation. He had done nothing wrong, and he had evidence to prove not only his innocence but also his valuable contribution to solving the crime. However, he also knew that powerful people sometimes preferred to blame messengers rather than acknowledge their own mistakes. Queen Camilla was waiting for James in her study, along with the head of palace security and the palace manager. The Queen's expression was serious but not hostile, which James took as a positive sign. However, the presence of senior officials suggested that this meeting would have significant consequences for his career, regardless of the outcome. The Queen began the conversation by acknowledging that she had received a full briefing from Inspector Hayes about the arrests and James's role in uncovering the conspiracy. Her voice was measured and formal, but James detected a note of embarrassment beneath her composed exterior. Queen Camilla explained that she had been shocked to learn the true extent of Victoria Pemberton's betrayal and the involvement of her own cousin in the theft. What happened next surprised James more than anything else in the entire investigation. Queen Camilla stood up from her desk, walked around to where James was standing at attention, and offered him a sincere and personal apology. She acknowledged that she had been too quick to suspect him of the theft and admitted that her willingness to blame him had been unfair and based on assumptions rather than evidence. The Queen explained that the pressure she had felt to resolve the matter quickly had led her to make poor decisions about how to handle the investigation. She had been worried about the potential scandal if news of the theft became public, and she had allowed that concern to cloud her judgment about who might be responsible for the crime. Queen Camilla admitted that she should have trusted in James's integrity and his record of faithful service rather than immediately assuming his guilt. James was deeply moved by the Queen's apology, but he was even more impressed by her willingness to acknowledge her mistakes in front of other senior staff members. The Queen's humility and honesty demonstrated the kind of leadership that had earned James's respect and loyalty over the years, and it reminded him why he had chosen to dedicate his life to serving the royal family. However, Queen Camilla's apology was just the beginning of what turned out to be a much longer and more significant conversation. The Queen explained that James's investigative work had not only solved the immediate problem of the missing brooch, but had also revealed serious weaknesses in the palace's security procedures and personnel screening processes. She wanted to discuss how these problems could be addressed to prevent similar incidents in the future. The head of palace security acknowledged that James had demonstrated skills and insights that could be valuable for improving the palace's overall security operations. The investigation had shown that traditional security measures were insufficient when the threat came from trusted insiders who had legitimate access to restricted areas. James's ability to think like a detective and to notice subtle patterns of suspicious behavior could be extremely useful for identifying future security risks. Queen Camilla then made an offer that James had never expected. She invited him to transition from his role as a palace guard to a new position as a security consultant, with responsibility for investigating potential threats and developing improved procedures for protecting the royal family and their property. The new role would come with significantly increased responsibilities, a substantial salary increase, and the opportunity to use his military and investigative skills in ways that his previous position had never allowed. James was honored by the offer, but he also felt conflicted about accepting such a significant change in his career. He had always taken pride in his role as a palace guard, and he was concerned that accepting a promotion that resulted from his investigation might create resentment among his colleagues. He asked for time to consider the offer and to discuss it with his wife Margaret before making a decision. The Queen agreed to give James time to think about the new position, but she also made it clear that his current role as a palace guard was secure regardless of his decision about the promotion. She emphasized that his investigation had demonstrated exactly the kind of loyalty and dedication that the royal family valued most in their staff members. James had risked his own career to protect the institution he served, and that commitment would not be forgotten. Before the meeting ended, Queen Camilla provided James with an update on the legal proceedings against the conspirators. Victoria Pemberton had been charged with theft, fraud, and conspiracy, and her confession had provided prosecutors with strong evidence for securing convictions. Lady Patricia Thornberry was facing similar charges, and her involvement had created a significant scandal within aristocratic circles where such behavior was considered particularly shocking. Alexander Whitmore had been charged not only with conspiracy to sell stolen goods but also with fraud related to his previous employment in the art world. The investigation into his activities had revealed a pattern of questionable appraisals and transactions that suggested the stolen brooch was not his first involvement in criminal activity. Marcus Rothschild was cooperating with authorities in exchange for reduced charges, and his information was helping investigators identify other potential victims of similar schemes. The Queen also informed James that the palace would be conducting a comprehensive review of its security procedures and personnel policies to prevent similar incidents in the future. The review would include background checks for all staff members with access to valuable items, improved surveillance systems, and better training for security personnel to recognize suspicious behavior patterns. James left the meeting feeling vindicated and respected, but also somewhat overwhelmed by the dramatic changes that his investigation had brought to his life. In the span of 3 weeks, he had gone from being a suspected criminal to being offered a significant promotion and earning the personal gratitude of Queen Camilla herself. The experience had taught him valuable lessons about the importance of persistence, courage, and standing up for the truth even when doing so involved personal risk. As James returned to his duties, he reflected on how different his situation was from just 24 hours earlier. The cloud of suspicion that had hung over him was gone, replaced by recognition and respect for his investigative abilities. However, he also knew that the real satisfaction came not from the personal benefits he had gained, but from the knowledge that justice had been served and that innocent people would not suffer for the crimes of others. The revelation that had changed everything was not just about proving his innocence, but about demonstrating that truth and justice were more important than protecting reputations or avoiding difficult conversations. James's investigation had shown that even the most carefully planned crimes could be exposed by someone with the determination to seek the truth and the courage to act on what they discovered. 3 months after the arrests of Victoria Pemberton, Lady Patricia Thornberry, and Alexander Whitmore, James Morrison found himself sitting in a completely different office within Buckingham Palace. The simple guards' quarters had been replaced by a modern security office equipped with advanced computer systems, surveillance monitors, and communication equipment that would have seemed like science fiction just a few months earlier. James had ultimately decided to accept Queen Camilla's offer to become a security consultant, but not without careful consideration and extensive discussions with his wife Margaret. The decision had been difficult because it meant leaving behind the traditional role that had defined his identity for over 2 decades. However, the opportunity to use his investigative skills to protect the royal family in new ways had proven too compelling to refuse. The transition to his new role had not been without challenges. Some of his former colleagues had initially viewed his promotion with suspicion, wondering whether he had somehow orchestrated the entire conspiracy to advance his own career. However, as the full details of his investigation became known within the palace community, these doubts had been replaced by respect and admiration for his dedication and skill. James's first major project in his new position had been to conduct a comprehensive security review that identified and addressed the vulnerabilities that had allowed the conspiracy to succeed. Working with Inspector Hayes and other law enforcement professionals, James had developed new procedures for background checks, access controls, and surveillance monitoring that significantly improved the palace's ability to detect and prevent insider threats. The review had revealed that Victoria Pemberton's financial problems and gambling addiction should have been identified during her employment screening process. James had recommended enhanced background investigations for all staff members with access to valuable items, including regular updates to ensure that financial difficulties or other personal problems were identified before they could lead to criminal behavior. James had also worked with the palace's information technology department to implement improved surveillance systems that would make it much more difficult for someone to delete or tamper with security footage. The new systems included multiple backup locations and automated alerts that would notify security personnel immediately if anyone attempted to access or modify recorded material. Perhaps most importantly, James had established a new protocol for investigating suspected theft or security breaches. Instead of immediately focusing on the most obvious suspects, investigators would now be required to consider all possible explanations and to gather evidence systematically before making accusations. The protocol emphasized the importance of protecting innocent staff members while ensuring that real criminals could not escape justice. Legal proceedings against the conspirators had concluded with significant prison sentences for all the main participants. Victoria Pemberton had received 4 years in prison for theft and conspiracy, while Lady Patricia Thornberry had been sentenced to 3 years for her role in planning and coordinating the crime. Alexander Whitmore had received the longest sentence, 5 years, due to his previous involvement in art fraud and his central role in attempting to sell the stolen brooch. Marcus Rothschild had received a suspended sentence in exchange for his cooperation with authorities, but his reputation in the art world had been destroyed by his involvement in the case. Several other clients had come forward with allegations of questionable transactions, and Rothschild's business had collapsed completely. The case had also led to increased scrutiny of the private art market and new regulations designed to prevent the sale of stolen goods. The impact of the case had extended far beyond the immediate participants. Queen Camilla had used the incident as an opportunity to strengthen the palace's commitment to integrity and transparency in all its operations. She had implemented new policies requiring regular audits of valuable items and had established clear procedures for reporting suspicious behavior without fear of retaliation. The Queen had also made a point of publicly recognizing James's contribution to solving the case, both to acknowledge his service and to send a clear message that the royal family valued honesty and dedication above all other qualities in their staff members. James had been awarded a commendation for exceptional service, and his story had become an inspiration for other palace employees who took pride in their role in protecting the institution. For James personally, The experience had been transformative in ways that extended far beyond his career advancement. The investigation had taught him that he possessed skills and capabilities that he had never fully recognized or utilized. His ability to observe human behavior, analyze complex situations, and pursue truth despite significant obstacles had proven to be valuable assets that could benefit not only his own career but also the security of the entire royal household. The relationship between James and Queen Camilla had also evolved significantly as a result of the case. The Queen's willingness to apologize for her initial suspicions and her recognition of James's valuable contribution had created a foundation of mutual respect that enhanced his effectiveness in his new role. James felt that he could now approach the Queen directly with security concerns or recommendations, knowing that his input would be taken seriously and acted upon appropriately. James's family life had also improved as a result of his career advancement. The increased salary from his new position had allowed him and Margaret to purchase a larger home and to provide better opportunities for their children's education. More importantly, the recognition and respect that James had earned had given him a renewed sense of pride and purpose that strengthened his relationships with his family members. Looking back on the events that had changed his life so dramatically, James often reflected on the importance of persistence and courage in the face of adversity. If he had accepted Queen Camilla's initial suspicions and allowed himself to be blamed for the theft, not only would his own career have been destroyed, but the real criminals would have escaped justice and continued their criminal activities. The revelation that had changed everything was not just about solving a single crime, but about demonstrating that truth and justice were achievable, even when powerful people preferred convenient explanations to difficult investigations. James's willingness to risk everything to prove his innocence had ultimately benefited everyone involved, from the royal family, to the palace staff, to the general public who deserved to know that their institutions were protected by people of integrity. As James settled into his new role and began working on his next security project, he carried with him the knowledge that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they had the courage to stand up for what was right. The guard who had once stood silently at his post had become a voice for justice, and his revelation had indeed changed everything for the better. The stolen brooch had been returned to its rightful place in Queen Camilla's collection, but its temporary absence had led to permanent improvements in how the palace protected all of its treasures. James Morrison had not only cleared his name, but had also helped ensure that future generations of royal guards would serve in an environment where integrity was valued, justice was pursued, and innocent people were protected from false accusations. The story that had begun with whispered accusations and deleted security footage had ended with truth, justice, and the recognition that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the most challenging circumstances. James's revelation had changed everything, and the palace was stronger and more secure because one man had refused to accept injustice without a fight.